29 years old, I got so sick that I had to stop working. I had this intermittent burning pain in my legs. I woke up each morning with sore and swollen joints, and I had a visible tremor. My body was so sluggish that I often needed help just to get to the bathroom, and my brain was so foggy that I could barely read. I eventually quit my job as an editor before I was fired for making too many obvious mistakes, and I rarely left the house. Presented with all of these symptoms, my doctor ran a few standard tests and told me that everything looked fine. She didn't see any reason to refer me to a specialist, and she suggested an antidepressant if things didn't improve. I was devastated. I'd lost my income and my social life, and I didn't know where else to turn for help. My husband of less than a year thought I was dying. My world was crumbling. I was 22 the last time my world fell apart. That's when my dad died, and I felt devastated and alone. I went hunting for stories that perfectly captured the grief I was feeling, and I found them. I read novels and essays and memoirs about losing a parent, and they made me feel seen, like I wasn't the first person to ever go through this. And so later, when I found myself disabled but undiagnosed, I went looking for stories about that too. Only this time, I couldn't find them. I couldn't find any traditionally published essays or books about life before diagnosis. I found a lot of stories that wanted to offer me hope, but none that could offer me solace. But how could that be? The CDC estimates that in 2018, there were almost 45 million people in this country living with at least one chronic condition that interferes with their daily life. And according to those estimates, that number is rising by more than 700,000 people per year on average. So it stands to reason that there are a whole lot of people living with unexplained symptoms right now, just like I was. I bet you know someone with an undiagnosed chronic illness. Maybe they complain about their health all the time, or they always seem to cancel plans. Maybe this has been happening for a while, and you've started to write them off as a hypochondriac or a drama queen. Maybe you believe that if something was seriously wrong, their doctor would have figured it out by now. That's what I believed. I believed that if you had a good doctor and a real illness, then diagnosis and recovery wouldn't be far behind. So why wasn't that happening for me? Since I couldn't find any stories about life before diagnosis, I decided to start collecting my own. And over the last couple years, I've interviewed around 70 people about their experiences with chronic illness, and I've shared those stories on a podcast called No End in Sight. I also spend a lot of time on Twitter, which is where today's artwork comes from, and I've heard hundreds, if not thousands, more anecdotes there. Chronic illness is a pretty big umbrella, and it would be impossible to list them all. Some of them are triggered by an injury, like a car accident, or something in your environment, like asbestos, or an acute infection, like the Epstein-Barr virus that can cause mono. Some of them are genetic, and some of them appear to be plain old bad luck. But they all have something in common, and that's the chronic part. They're health conditions that can't be cured, and so they must be managed. Most people describe a daily baseline of symptoms that they live with all the time, and then periods of more intense symptoms that are usually called flares. When I had to stop working at 29, it turned out to be a flare caused by toxic mold in my house. And so these days, I still live with symptoms every day, and I don't work full time, but I have a few good hours most days when I can read or write or participate in events like this one. Some people live totally normal lives with their symptom baseline, while many other people find it hard to leave their homes or their beds because their symptom baseline makes regular life impossible. I interviewed a woman named Rachel who was diagnosed as a teenager with myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME, which you might know as chronic fatigue syndrome. And at the time, her doctor told her that she would rather be diagnosed with a treatable cancer than with ME. And if you don't know much about chronic illness, then that might sound incredibly inflammatory, because cancer is serious, and we all know it. But chronic illness is serious too. It's been years since she got that diagnosis, and Rachel told me that she appreciated how honest her doctor was, and she felt validated to have her illness taken seriously, even though it wasn't life-threatening. There are a lot of chronic illnesses that are unlikely to take your life, but incredibly likely to take you away from the life you love. Over the course of my interviews, I've learned that there are a lot of misunderstandings about diagnosis that leave genuinely sick people feeling isolated and unsupported, just like I felt. Most people I talk to have spent years wondering if their symptoms are all in their heads. And even worse, they often feel like their loved ones believe that too. Like their loved ones are writing them off as weak or lazy. Without a medical confirmation of their illness, most people feel uncomfortable asking for accommodations or using mobility aids. And without a diagnosis, people can't access benefits, disabled parking passes, or even patient support groups. It turns out that diagnosis wasn't nearly as clear-cut as I thought it was. Not only does it take a long time, but people are often misdiagnosed along the way. I've spoken to 2 people with a genetic condition called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome who were initially diagnosed with lupus, an autoimmune disease. I've spoken to someone with Lyme disease who was initially told that she has diabetes, and someone with diabetes who was initially told that nothing was wrong at all. And almost everyone I talk to has had a doctor blame all of their symptoms on stress, depression, or anxiety. Often your doctor will tell you that's the cause without consulting a mental health professional and without offering you any follow-up testing or specialized care. That's what happened to me when my doctor offered me an antidepressant instead of a neurology referral. But even when you and your doctor both agree that you have the right diagnosis, it might not explain anything. If you have an autoimmune condition like Hashimoto's disease, then you might learn that your immune system is attacking your own tissue, but nobody knows why. And there are clinical diagnoses like fibromyalgia that we don't know how to find in lab work yet, and so you're left wondering what is happening, in addition to why. And if that's not frustrating enough, your diagnosis might not come with any good evidence-based treatment options. Science and medicine are still looking for answers, and research funding isn't distributed what I'd call fairly. Plus, it can take a long time for academic research to make its way into medical practice. So many people I talk to are cobbling together their own treatment options through some combination of off-label drugs, dietary experiments, and plenty of rest. Rest is actually one of the most effective tools for managing or preventing symptom flares, but prioritizing rest can be incredibly difficult and sometimes impossible when you have bills to pay and a family to care for. Our medical system also has this glaring problem where there's no feedback loop to let doctors know when they're wrong. So if you're living with unexplained pain or fatigue and your doctor can't help you, you might go looking for a new doctor. And while your new doctor may help you get a diagnosis, your old doctor will go on believing, wrongly, that you were just another anxious hypochondriac. So how do you actually get a diagnosis? It turns out that it's more of a process than an event, and I'm going to explain that by telling you about Felicia, a woman I interviewed. When Felicia was 25, she started to feel this intermittent tingling in her legs, and so she went to a neurologist who ran some nerve conduction studies and told her that she had idiopathic neuropathy before sending her on her way. Idiopathic is one of those words that comes up a lot in these stories. It basically means, yes, this is happening, but we don't know why. Anyway, so Felicia was working these long days on her feet, and her legs kept misbehaving. Over the next 3 years, she started to need longer and longer breaks just to get some relief from this neuropathy. And by the time she was 28, it got so bad that she had to stop working. Felicia told me that she could barely walk, but she had to make up an excuse when she called off work because she didn't have an actual explanation to give her boss. And I want to tell on myself a little bit here by letting you know that a lot of stories start this way. Right now, this could be a story about fibromyalgia or functional neurological disorder or ME, which I mentioned earlier. But I chose Felicia's story because unlike those diagnoses I just listed, Felicia's illness is no longer shrouded in skepticism and stigma. So after a few weeks of using her grandma's walker to get around the house, Felicia went to the ER, where she got an MRI and was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And then Felicia spent 6 weeks in the hospital trying to recover from this flare that might have been prevented or at least diminished if her MS had been caught earlier, closer to when her symptoms started. And this time between symptom onset and diagnosis is glossed over in a lot of illness narratives. For Felicia, that time lasted 3 years. I've spoken to people who spent a couple weeks in this phase, and I've spoken to people who spent literal decades in this phase. People in this phase are often classified as problem patients, the worried well, hypochondriacs, malingerers, and even drug seekers. People in this stage can feel isolated and crazy and scared because their bodies are failing them, but nobody knows why. They often have little support from their friends, family, and colleagues because most of the general public doesn't know about this stage at all. They watch House or Grey's Anatomy or ER, and they believe somehow the diagnosis should be instantaneous. But it's not instantaneous. First, there's the alarm you feel when your body stops behaving the way that you expect it to. And the frustration when your test results come back normal, and so you're left to wonder if maybe this is all in your head. In our current system, most doctors can only spend 15 to 20 minutes with their patients, and that's not enough time to take a comprehensive health history. Most of my interviews last well over an hour. And during those early appointments, you might feel like your doctor doesn't really understand what's going on with your body or how serious it is. Fatigue, for example, takes on a whole new meaning when you become chronically ill. It's not the same as being tired, and you have a vocabulary problem if that's what your doctor hears when you tell them about your fatigue. One woman I spoke to, Randy, spent decades looking for answers before she was diagnosed with Ehlers-Danlos syndrome at the age of 50. And she told me that she started to describe her sometimes debilitating fatigue to doctors by telling them she felt like she'd had 2 bottles of Benadryl. So next comes the difficult and sometimes slow process of validating your symptoms. Our private insurance system can be tough to navigate, and they sometimes refuse to pay for tests or treatments that your doctor thinks you need. And of course, not everyone can afford insurance in the first place. So in order to access specialized care, you need approval from your insurance company. You need the money to pay for your copay or your deductible. You need time off work for probably a lot of appointments. And you may need to travel to another city or even another state just to find a doctor who might know how to help you. Specialized care isn't accessible to a lot of people. And even when you can access specialized care, you still need to find a doctor who believes you. Systemic bias in medicine is a huge problem that treats some patients like they're not credible. This bias impacts Black patients, women, young people, anybody with a pre-existing mental health diagnosis, and folks who are told to lose weight before they can access follow-up care. But if you have the energy to be persistent, and the money to pay for specialists, and the support to travel to multiple doctors, then your chart will start to fill up with the formal names for your symptoms. My chart, for example, now says that I have small fiber neuropathy and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, neurological stuff. And then, at some point, hopefully, your symptoms will start to tell a story that your doctor understands. At some point, you get a diagnosis. Diagnosis itself can be incredibly fraught. People tell me over and over again that their diagnosis brought them validation because it confirmed that they hadn't been imagining their experience this whole time. And it gave them permission to rest instead of constantly pushing their bodies until they flared and to ask for accommodations. It also gave them the language they needed to connect with other people who understand, and I can't overstate how important this is. Access to patient communities changes lives. But diagnosis could also be anticlimactic, because as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't always come with an explanation, let alone a cure. And sometimes it comes long after you've been managing your symptoms with the limited options available. But one of the strangest things about diagnosis is that sometimes it's the first time that the people around you acknowledge your struggle and express sympathy, as if the diagnosis itself is the bad news. But when you've been living with disabling symptoms that are unexplained for months, years, or even decades, the diagnosis itself is usually not the bad part. It might even be a relief. And even if you're relieved, this whole process can be riddled with grief. Earlier, I mentioned losing my dad and how hard that was. When I became chronically ill, I felt like I was losing myself. Still, I find myself grieving the life I had before. I used to manage an online publication and collaborate on a monthly storytelling event and volunteer 3 different places every week. I used to get my fulfillment from the things I did. And then suddenly, I couldn't count on my brain and body to function on any given day, and I had to find fulfillment elsewhere. But when I lost my dad, the people around me had some context for what I was feeling. Even if they'd never lost a parent themselves, they'd seen stories about losing a parent on TV and in movies and in books. They had a vague idea about what they were supposed to say. And when I got so sick that I disappeared from my own life, most of the people around me had no context for what was happening. They didn't know that you could get that sick and never really get better. And since they'd never seen a story like mine before, they struggled to imagine what I was feeling and what they were supposed to say. And so hopefully, today, I've given you a little bit of context about what it's like to become chronically ill. I'm sure some of you have been through this before and you're managing a chronic illness right now. And I bet some of you are in that excruciating stage where everyone implies that it's all in your head. It's not. It just takes time. And maybe some of you are healthcare professionals who went into medicine because you wanted to help people, but you don't know what to say to patients you can't help. I'm going to tell you right now that the most powerful thing that you can do for a patient who might be chronically ill is to believe them, even if you don't know how to help them. And actually, that's true for all of you. The most powerful thing that you can do for anybody in your life who's navigating an ongoing health issue is to believe them. Believe that they're trying as hard as they can to get to the root of the problem, instead of imagining that you'd know what to do in their situation. Believe that they're using all available resources to build the best life possible, instead of bombarding them with suggestions about how to get healthy. Believe that they found their body's limits through exhausting trial and error, instead of encouraging them to just push a little harder. And more than anything else, believe them when they tell you how they feel, instead of looking for a silver lining in their pain or their grief. Whatever they're going through, believe them. It's enough. Thank you. Thanks.